Welcome to Book at Lunchtime. Today we have a poetry showcase in which we will be discussing two remarkable works, young British poets and selected poems of Sergio Raimondi. So for those of you who may be new to Torch Book at Lunchtime, this series is one of our longest standing flagship events. We have films of every book featured going back to 2013. And so Book at Lunchtime now enters its 11th year with a growing history and heritage. We've been privileged to feature an astonishing variety of books and authors over the years. So please do visit our website if you're curious about previous discussions. So I noticed that our last discussion 2 weeks ago was on the perils of interpreting, which I find quite interesting because today's, I think, might be subtitled The Power of Poetry and the Power of Translation. And we're very pleased to welcome an impressive array of participants in this talk today. Professor Ben Bollig, poet Mark Leech, Professor Alejandra Crosta, and the esteemed Argentine poet Sergio Raimondi, who is joining us from Argentina. And this has taken a little bit of negotiation, but hello and welcome. And our chair for the proceedings today is Professor Adriana X Jacobs, who is an associate professor of Hebrew literature in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Adriana's own book, After Clarice, was a book at lunchtime at Torch not so long ago. So we're in very expert hands. And I'll hand over now to Adriana, who will guide us through the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. So first it's very exciting to be a part of this event and to celebrate these two different, but I think also overlapping projects. And I'll have a lot of questions about both of them. But first I'm going to introduce our panelist and an author. So this might take a little while because they're very distinguished people at this table. I'm going to start at the end with Professor Ben Bollig, who is Professor of Latin American Literature and Film and Fellow and Tutor in Spanish at St. Catherine's, or St. Cat's if you're local. His research areas include contemporary literature and film in Latin America with a particular focus on Argentina and its poetry. And the fruit of this research can be found in his numerous scholarly publications, including Politics and Public Space in Contemporary Argentine Poetry, Modern Argentine Poetry, Displacement, Exile, and Migration, and more recently, Moving Verses, a study on Argentine cinema. His published translations include Cristian Aliaga's The Foreign Passion, and for Poetry International Festival Rotterdam, he's translated poems by Martín Gambarota and Sergio Raimondi, our special guest today. His translations with Mark Leech of Raimondi have been collected in one of the books we're celebrating today, this volume, Sergio Raimondi's Selected Poems, which was published recently by Liverpool University Press. And then next to him, we have Oxford-based poet and translator Mark Leech, who has published, in addition to chapbooks of original poetry, published chapbooks of Old English and Spanish translations, including selected poems by Lorca, as well as his translation with Ben Bollig of Raimondi's poetry, which we'll talk today, and we'll also get to hear some of his poems translated into Spanish by Alejandra Crosta, which is exciting. And then we have Alejandra Crosta, who is a translator and scholar and lecturer in Spanish in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. Her research interests fall mainly in the areas of translation, Latin American literature and film, poetry, language learning, and teaching. In addition to her academic work, she's worked as a translator for the International Federation of Actors and other NGOs and several European Commission agencies in the cultural sector, with a particular emphasis on the performing arts and intellectual property rights. I can't even begin to imagine the translation challenges there. Her translations include the Spanish translation of the graphic novel Red Rose by Kate Evans, which I personally think is brilliant. And one of the books we're celebrating today, her translation with Ben Bollig of Joven Poesía Británica, this book, Young British Poets, which is a collection of poetry in Spanish translation, which was published in 2023 by the Argentine press Espacio Hudson. But it's also the second edition of this anthology, which first came out in 2015 and was later updated to reflect current political realities, but we'll say more about that. And last but not least, we have joining us on Zoom, Sergio Raimondi, hello, hola, an award-winning poet, translator, scholar who is based in Bahía Blanca in the Buenos Aires province in Argentina. The current volume, translated by Bollig and Leech, brings together selections of Raimondi's poetry from the collections Poesía Civil, a civil poetry, which came out in 2001, and Lexicon, which came out last year. As a translator, he's published his translations of Catullus in the volume Catulito, which was published in 1999, and I understand has recently translated works by Lucretius. He's the recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, among other accolades, and currently teaches Latin American literature at the Universidad Nacional del Sur in Argentina. So welcome, Sergio. And so with that, I want to invite Ben and Sergio and Mark. I'm not sure who's going to be doing. I think we're going to start with Sergio reading from this wonderful volume, the selected poems. So I'll hand the floor over to you.
Primero yo quiero simplemente, discúlpenme que use mi español, pero me siento más cómodo, pero sí quiero, bueno, por supuesto agradecer la presencia de todos allí. Pero básicamente agradecer a mis traductores, a Ben y a Mark. Traducir es una tarea muy compleja, que no solo demanda un conocimiento muy preciso de la lengua, sino también una especie de comunión, que implica el afecto, que implica el cuidado, que implica el compromiso, que implica la concentración. Y realmente tanto Mark como Ben han tenido sobradamente esas cualidades.
For non-Spanish speakers in the audience, firstly, just Sergio was saying that he hopes you don't mind if he speaks in Spanish. He wanted to say thanks to everybody for being here, and also thanks for the invitation from Torch, and to all the authors here, Adriana as well. He also talked about how translation is a very difficult exercise, that it involves a great knowledge of language, but also a sense of communion. And as well, he talked about the importance in translation of feeling, affecto, affect, and also the commitment of the translators. And he was very kind there, and he said that Mark and I had both shown that a lot in this work. Bueno, gracias, Sergio. Y ahora vas a leer el poema IPA. Sergio is going to read a poem called IPA or IPA.
IPA. Quizás no sea una ocurrencia ocurrente, justo ahora en medio de los festejos, al borde de la pinta acercar la nariz para notar en los aromas del lúpulo, responsable de la palidez amarga, característica peculiar de ese sabor, la solución para que toneles y toneles, en las embarcaciones ya descargadas, de algodón o fina seda se cargaran, en el muelle ribereño de la compañía, monopólica de la nación propagadora, de la concepción del libre comercio, soportaran el trayecto de 6 meses tras atravesar el ecuador matemático y lento circunvalar el cabo africano, entre elevadas temperaturas y olas que de un lado al otro los desplazaban, llegaran al puerto populoso de Madrás y en las gargantas resecas terminaran, no de la desinteresada población local, sino de los burócratas civiles y oficiales, del ejército del imperio atareados, día a día, en jugar al tenis o disparar, sentados sobre un elefante legendario, para hacer una concesión al exotismo, tigres surgidos de pronto entre tecas, y acostumbrar así al paladar al curry o al arroz pilaf con sorbos de esta bebida, hasta volverla tan habitual y necesaria que décadas después, ya de regreso, en una metrópolis por siempre alterada, hubo gran demanda interna para llenar la jarra espumosa con que desayunaban a las 3, 4 de la tarde, aturdidos ante su color ambivalente y extraño.
Muchas gracias, Sergio. Fue muy emocionante escuchar tu voz leerlo, porque nunca había oído antes. Okay, I'm going to read it in English now. IPA. Perhaps not an occurring occurrence, just now in the midst of festivities, to bring the nose in closer to the pint, to observe, in the aroma of hops responsible for the bitter paleness, peculiar aspect of this flavour, the answer that meant barrels and barrels in the embarkations once unloaded of cotton or silk would be loaded on the riverside wharf of the monopoly of the nation that first propagated the ideology around free trade, would endure for the journey of 6 months via the mathematical equator circumnavigating Africa's cape among the high temperatures and waves that rolled them from one side to the other, would land at the crowded port of Madras, and would finish up in the thirsty throats not of disinterested locals, but of civil servants and officials of the Imperial Army busy day to day, playing tennis or shooting, sat on a legendary elephant as a concession to the exotic, tigers rushing suddenly from the teaks, and getting the palate used to curry or pilau rice by sipping from this drink until the habit's so necessary that some decades later, having returned to a metropolis forever changed, there was a great internal need to fill the foaming glass with which they breakfasted at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, stunned by its colour, ambivalent and strange.
Wonderful. Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear the two voices, this poem. It's like experiencing two poems that almost like two different poems, but also the same poem at the same time. I want to start with a question for Ben. So most of my commentary is going to take the form of questions. Because one of the things that really fascinates me about translation as a fellow translator of poetry is the invitation to create a work that doesn't exist in the original language. And I don't just mean the translation itself. In the case of this book, of the selected poems, you're bringing two books, well, both you and Mark are bringing two books together, published almost 20 years apart. And so one expects that in those 20 years, Sergio has changed as a poet in voice and style. And not to mention that the poem that we just heard comes from this book Lexicon, which is almost 500 pages in Spanish. And this is clearly not 500 pages. So I'm really interested, and both of you can weigh in on this, is how, were there any organizing principles you had in place putting this together, or did it come about intuitively? Could you describe for us a bit of the process of curating this book?
So I've been translating Sergio for quite a long time, and someone once asked me what I worked on, and I once joked that I work on the literature of the future. Lexicon is a book that has existed in germinal form for a number of years, and eventually did come out in 2023. So I translated Sergio a number of years ago for the Rotterdam Poetry International Festival, and I did it on my own, and the versions were kind of okay. But Mark and I have known each other for a long time, and we've had various translation projects that we've worked on together. And when it occurred to me that one, we could, this deserved to be put together as a book, and two, that Lexicon was going to come out and it would work really nicely to have the two volumes together. The 20 years apart, I also felt there was a nice kind of, what's the word? It was a nice, what's the word I'm looking for? Synergy. Yeah, no, there was so in terms of organizing principles, I'd done versions of quite a lot of these poems already, and then Mark and I talked about it, and then Mark did his versions of them as well. And then it became a dialogue between us and also between the different versions that we've done. In terms of the selection, some of it was things that I translated before. Others were poems that leapt out at me from earlier versions. There's a German edition of Lexicon, which was published, translated by Timo Berger. So there were poems that had seen the light of day earlier. And the other question, I guess, was translatability. Was poems that you feel you can make a good version of that speak to an audience. And so working with Mark, what was really important for me was I'm not a poet. I have no pretension to be a poet. And there's a kind of craft and a feel for language in English, which I would never claim to have. I've never been I don't write poetry. But I think I am quite good at working out what things mean in Spanish. And so doing these kind of parallel versions and then putting them in dialogue took the more sort of, let's say, philological or literary work that I do with, I don't want to say intuitive, because that's maybe to undermine it, but there's something that, there's just a turn of phrase or a way of handling words that I think Mark's got that I could never achieve.
I think it's an interesting sort of idea, sort of bringing together. My Spanish is okay. It's not academic level like Ben's. So when I did my versions of Sergio's, I was really just going, right, how does this feel? How does this feel? How does this feel? How does it sound when I read it out? I mean, this was a lockdown project, so I was pacing around a flat, reciting Sergio's poems to myself, trying to get the sound. It was really interesting actually, because Ben would so often come up with a version with 3 or 4 different alternatives for one particular word. And then it became a question of, right, okay, how does this word fit in? Does it fit the meter that I've picked? Because Sergio's work is very metrical. And so I wanted the English versions to be metrical as well, and to have all the resources, certainly of iambic verse. So we've got the academic, what's the correct word, literally speaking, and what is a correct word poetically speaking. Unfortunately, it actually often worked out that they were the same word, thank goodness. So that was it was very organic, I think. Even though we're starting from kind of quite different approaches, I think. And you say sort of intuitive, but yes, instinctive immediate response. Write down, how does it sound, how does it feel, versus a more academic side, and then bringing the two together. And I think in terms of dialogue, and in terms of dialogue with Sergio's original text, it was probably the most interesting project I've ever worked on as a writer, because it had all these different voices interplaying, coming together, and coming out with something that in the end you think, well, actually, that's really good, in the sense that it is both an original poem in English, but also as faithful as it could possibly be to Sergio's original. Certainly from my point of view, if it doesn't work in English, it doesn't work. And then no matter how accurate it is as a translation. So finding that exact fine balance. And it felt like a lot of the time we really got that, and it wasn't that hard in a way to achieve.
I just want to follow up on that. I mean, first of all, I would say that if you're translating poetry, you're probably more of a poet than you're giving yourself credit for. But I find this whole, the distinction between the academic and the poetic really interesting, partly because I think something you both have highlighted is that it tends to blur. It can't be quite so neatly demarcated. But in the introduction, I think, Ben, you described the process of bringing 2 versions together rather than more traditional sort of approach where 2 translators will divide up the work and then they'll just initial or sign off on their translations. And you've spoken how this fusion sort of works in practice, which I think is really interesting, and also shows that there's a lot of trust and generosity in the way that you both come with these 2 versions and sort of find ways to get them to sort of sing in unison. But Mark, coming also as a poet, having published your own poetry, I think translation is no doubt also a very creative practice. What's it like bringing someone else, in this case Ben, into that process?
That's That's a good question. It's actually very reassuring because you're not only reliant on your own judgment. Because it's always kind of, if I had a question about the Spanish, I was like, I know Ben's going to have the answer to this one. So, yeah, I think it wasn't actually kind of, it's almost like you say, bringing in another voice, but actually in a way, because as I said, it was very organic, it didn't really feel like two separate voices. It was kind of, we're just starting with two slightly different impressions. It's almost like we'd both been sat painting a landscape in slightly different places and then bringing the images together rather than that we're doing completely different things.
And so one of the ways that often these kind of translation pairings work is that the sort of academic sends a kind of plain prose version with gloss and notes. And there were notes. I mean, I would footnote things, but I did kind of try to write something that felt like it was a poem, but just very aware of my limitations. Like if I tried to write iambic pentameters, it would sound plodding, it doesn't come out right. I don't have that ear. But I would try and do something poetic. And like sometimes it was really amazing. It would come back with like one word different or two words reversed. And I'd think, I can't believe I didn't see that. But once it had been done, things fell into place. And yeah, it is reassuring in the way that that I know that I feel that I can do that work of literary analysis, and then having Mark with the kind of poet's ear, without wanting to sound too abstract. I think that was really reassuring for me in the sense of knowing that we would have something that stood up as a poem. Because although it's a facing pages book, we wanted people to be able to read it just to use the Spanish as a check, as it were.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I have so many more questions, but I'm also mindful of our schedule. So I think we'll move on to the next book, yeah, if I'm following the schedule correctly. And then maybe we'll come back if there's time. I also had a question for Sergio, but which I could ask now, but I don't want to cut into the Q&A. So maybe we'll just come back to it. Okay, so we're going to move on to this next volume, Joven Poesía Británica, Young British Poets, which is really, I thought was so fascinating. As you can maybe tell from my voice, I was born in the United States, and so I think I'm still learning about young British poets. But it was both interesting to have this particular collection of poems, and then to see it in Spanish, which I thought also kind of added this whole other layer to my sort of understanding of this really rich selection of poetry. But I understand you have some selections you're going to read from the poem. Yeah, we're going to be treated to some of Mark's poems, Mark Leech's poems, which appear in this volume. Yeah.
Okay, so this is January Common. Too cold for toadstools. Orange smudges on stained wood. White caps flat in the pale grass. The new year entombed. We talk about the future. Wind teeth on the rims of our ears. 100 words like ours patter like dogs round frozen pools, turn back following children down grey avenues, out of hearing. Too cold for toadstools. The frost sews them up, snaps their stems. Trees thin as hairs bow over soil black leaves. No better time to kiss.
But now in Spanish, sorry, I had a cold, so my voice is not in its best shape. Parque en enero. Demasiado frío para hongos. Borrones anaranjados en la madera manchada. Cabezas blancas en el pálido pasto. El año nuevo sepultado. Hablamos del futuro. Dientes de viento alrededor de las orejas. 100 palabras como las nuestras corretean como perros entre charcos congelados. Se dan vuelta, siguiendo niños, por avenidas grises, donde no se oye. Demasiado frío para hongos. La escarcha lo sutura, rompe sus tallos. Árboles flacos como hilachas se doblan sobre hojas negras como el barro. No hay mejor momento para besarse.
Thank you. Is that it? Great, wonderful. I'm going to start with another translation-related question for Alejandra, but then I'd like to hear more about this volume and its history, which I think is so interesting. But Alejandra, as a translator, I know you've worked in an impressive range of genres, both alone but also in these collaborations like this book. Can you speak a bit about the linguistic and creative muscles that you utilize for the translation of poetry and how that maybe differs from, say, translating an NGO document?
Yes. If I'm translating poetry or kind of more creative work, I use my visual muscle, if you like, a lot. I try to visualize the images, of course, and I do a lot of research, looking for pictures. Even, for example, here when it talks about the toadstools, I look for images to see the colors, what they say to me. So for me, the visual aspect is very important, and that's what I do when I'm teaching here translation. I always ask my students, close your eyes and imagine that you are telling a story with your own words. Because I think you, in that sense, you avoid to do word by word. You try to kind of to create a narrative, that is yours, but being loyal to the text. So I relate a lot of that aspect, visual, and we had to do other poems. I did a lot of research as well. And the musicality, the sounds. And it's interesting because the sounds in English are different, not just the words, the rhythm is very different. So you need to try to create their own rhythm on the poetry. But I think, and I was trying to think so which beats do you stress in English and which beats do you stress in Spanish? And it's not necessarily the same stress. So, and I think it's important that you try to find their own rhythm so the sounds are very important to me. And this is completely different when you translate a document for an NGO. What implies a lot of research, of course, legislation, but also you have to accommodate to a particular organization. For example, when we started to use inclusive language, at the very stage, you had to write, because the agency asked me to do los y las, because Spanish is very marked language. I didn't like from the point of view of style, but that was what the person or the organization who asked me to do the translation, I had to follow that rule. And also, yes, it's a lot of research, reading about legislation, but also allows you as well to see the other point of view. And because I always say, oh yeah, I'm for free rights, for everybody. But when you see what it means, copyright for an actor, you see the other point of view. So you say, oh yes, I'm for free, free rights for everybody. I don't want any copyrights. But when you see what it means for another person, you see what is important for the person you are translating with. So I think it's important, to think about who is going to read the work as well.
Yeah, yeah.
If it makes any sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And actually that segues beautifully into my next question, sort of for Mark. Something I think that it's in the introduction to the Raimondi book. It says in the introduction that Sergio's poems can disorient and unsettle you. He is asking us to see the world from new angles against the grain. And you mentioned sort of the new points of view that sometimes translation invites a translator into and to engage with. But for Mark, I think this is sort of a question I've always asked poets who are translated. What is it like to see your work in Spanish, especially coming also as a translator of Spanish language poetry? And what does it unsettle in a positive way, but maybe also negative way, by your own understanding of your poetry?
I think it translates it from a very specific place in London, Wandsworth Common, to it being of somewhere else, which I actually quite liked. The sense that it had been transplanted and it was growing as almost if you'd done the same thing with a plant. You'd taken a cutting from it and put it somewhere else, and it was growing into its own individual life and its own forming part of its own ecosystem as something else. I mean, I personally don't feel very possessive about my work, and I feel like I need to keep hold of it and watch it. I'm much happier to see it go somewhere else and transform. And I think for me that was initially when Ben emailed about it, I was like, oh, this sounds brilliant, because I wanted to see how it would appear. And actually that then evolved into me of really appreciating how it feels that what you wrote, it's not yours anymore, it's growing somewhere else. How does it become that different? It becomes more part of a wider community rather than simply your own work. So I thought it was great, actually. I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, what I really love about the translation that Alejandra and Ben did of your poem is that it introduces sort of some rhymes that I think Spanish allows for a little more organically, but that really worked for me. It didn't feel like it was sort of departing. It almost felt like it was still like in the spirit of the space of the poem, of the original poem, but I really just loved it. Or like the word hongos lands differently, to the ear, has this texture that so it was really interesting to have access to both versions. And I guess the other question, and maybe Ben, you can start with this one, but also I think anyone can weigh in, is I'm really curious about the reception of this book in say it's published by an Argentine press, but I imagine circulates where Spanish is read and spoken. And because also there's the market for poetry and translation is pretty small, kind of everywhere, that I was also intrigued that it came out in 2015 and then that you had the opportunity to expand and then republish a second edition, which is, I feel like sometimes that's rare for translations. So maybe if you can speak a bit about that.
It's kind of to do with a wildfire, the second edition. So I mean, the first edition, like a lot of the best projects, started in the pub, which is that I was in a pub in Leeds and I was reading Jean Sprackland, and I just was absolutely captivated by Tilt. And I thought I'd just quite like to have a go at putting these into Spanish. And I did, and they were okay. And I sent them to Cristian Aliaga, who's the publisher, and he published them in his, he has a newspaper with a cultural supplement in El Extremo Sur, in the very far south, Comodoro Rivadavia in Patagonia. And then Alejandra and I then kind of got talking about this, and then we just sort of started doing more and more. And the reception of the book, I mean, it's not their, they are a publisher who specialise particularly in poetry, but they particularly specialise in poetry from the far south, Patagonian poetry by writers of indigenous First Peoples. And nevertheless, one of the things they found was it sold really well. So the money that they made selling this book was used to fund some of their other publishing endeavours. And then, very sadly, when the wildfires hit in Patagonia a few years ago, Cristian basically lost a warehouse, lost a store with about 5,000 or 7,000 books in it, which was all their stock, pretty much all of their stock. And so we thought, well, what can we do to help? And one of the things we could do is do a second edition, because it's a book that sold well. And it also gave Alejandra and I a chance to do a couple of things. One is we wanted to kind of diversify the selection of poets. We want poets who reflected on the way things had changed in the UK over the last few years. And it also gave us a chance to go back and address something, which was a comment that one reader, my friend the novelist Carlos Gamero, had made, which was that in a number of poems the voice was too neutral. And he gave a particular example, which was there's a poem by Sprackland where we use a phrase in the first edition, al envés, which means kind of inside out. And he said, nobody says al envés. It's a really kind of, it's stilted. And we thought, yeah, okay, actually. And we had not exactly gone for a neutral Spanish, but both, well, Alejandra speaks Argentine Spanish, Alejandra's Argentine, speaks Argentine Spanish. It's often said that my Spanish is kind of a bit Argentine as well. So when we got the chance to do a second edition, as well as making the selection more representative, let's say, of where British poetry is today, we also went back and looked at a lot of them, and where the more kind of lyric poems, we thought, okay, like the brakes are coming off now, so we're actually going to put this in a lyric voice, which feels a bit more like how we might write lyric poetry. So there are some poems where it's like found text or quoted text, or it's the voice is not meant to be a contemporary lyric voice, but where it was contemporary lyric poetry, we felt we're gonna write this as if almost as if these were Argentine writers.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I had a question about that because obviously English is quite varied in on this island, and it's also quite varied in Latin America. So sort of trying to decide, yeah, how you're going to sort of acknowledge that is really fascinating. Did you want to add something?
No, we did it into Argentinian Spanish. For example, the second form, informal way is voz, the voceo. We use that voice because it's, we use in Argentina, so it could be more authentic. But I was also thinking, what do the words mean to you as a reader? And for example, I was very, very upset by a poem that J. Bernard, Carrying Limpieza. And to me, reminds me, the dictatorship and someone who is, kidnapped by the dictatorship, torture. And so, but this is what it says to me from, being from Argentina. But it was written by a person in a different country with a different history. So, and a poem can evoke different things according to your own personal history. And so for me, that was a very difficult poem to, to translate, to read, and because it had all that kind of memories. So, and also, for example, the one about Uber. So, in Argentina there is Uber as well, but for me, the difficult thing about this poem, I think it's almost no adjectives at all. I think I counted 2. So in that point, and we use a lot of adjectives in Spanish. So in that word, how do you get that rhythm? That rhythm translate, when you work 0-hour contract, the gig economy. So that kind of ornamentation is the way in which you work this day. No breaks, 0 economy. So there is a kind of, you can read into that, into the poem. And how can something that means something in one culture, because it's not just a language, it's a culture, represents something in one culture. What is representing the other culture?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's so fascinating. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions from the audience.
Do you want to ask Sergio
I did
that
have.
question?
May I?
Let's talk to Sergio.
So it's basically the question I asked Mark, but pitched to Sergio. If it's okay, I'm going to ask it in Spanish, and then I can translate it for you into English, and then we'll see what Sergio does. Is that okay? Okay, Sergio, mi pregunta. En las palabras de Ben Bollig, él dice, los poemas de Sergio tienen la capacidad de desorientar y inquietar, nos invitan a ver el mundo desde nuevos ángulos contra la corriente. Entonces, mi pregunta tiene que ver con la experiencia de ser traducido y si este proceso te desorienta o inquieta, con respecto a cómo entiendes tu propia poesía o cómo te ves a ti mismo como poeta. Y ahora les voy a decir en inglés y después volvemos a la pregunta. So this is basically the question I asked to Mark about in the introduction, Sergio's poems were described as disorienting and unsettling. He's asking us to see the world from new angles against the grain. So I asked Sergio, what has the process of being translated unsettled for you with respect to how you understand your own poetry or how you see yourself as a poet? Entonces.
Para mí la experiencia de la traducción, y en particular esta experiencia de traducción con Ben y Mark, es una experiencia de gran aprendizaje. Inclusive me refiero a aprendizaje sobre mi propia escritura, de advertir posibilidades de sentido, posibilidades de lectura, perspectivas que posiblemente no tuve en cuenta, porque efectivamente, no sé si Ben está tomando nota, porque sin duda cada lengua implica mundos diferentes. Y cuando digo mundos diferentes, no solo estoy hablando de una dimensión lingüística, sino estoy hablando también de dimensiones económicas, históricas, que no se pueden separar unas de otras. Entonces esa experiencia para mí probablemente implique cierta desorientación. Y probablemente si la poesía no implicara cierta desorientación, no sé si terminaría siendo poesía, ¿no?
Gracias.
So summarizing, so one of the parts of this experience of being translated is of learning, of aprendizaje, of learning about one's own writing, learning about the different possibilities of feeling, different possibilities of reading. And many of these possibilities are things that maybe the writer hadn't actually realized. Every language implies a world, a different worlds, not just a linguistic world, but also what might be called economies of emotion. And so language and emotion can't be separated. And what that means then is that the experience of being translated is always disorienting, that Sergio did feel a sense of disorientation reading his work in translation, but also that if it wasn't disorientating, then it wouldn't be poetry as a result. Más o menos así, ¿no, Sergio? ¿Sí?
Es cierto, así, más o menos así.
Bueno, me alegro. Thanks, gracias.
Thank you so much. And now we welcome questions from the audience.
I wouldn't want to go out without my makeup on. I guess so. I mean, I think in none of these cases does that exist, because there was never, so in the case of the young British poets, there are definitely earlier versions, but there's never an attempt to just kind of write it out in prose or to do a sort of non-poetic version. And in the case with Sergio, I never did, neither Mark nor I, we didn't do a sort of just a kind of a word for word or a literal or anything like that. Part of the reason I think in all of those cases is because, well, certainly in the case with Sergio, a lot of the meaning is in the form. And so if you just try to write it out word for word, then I don't know what you'd get as a result. So maybe, yeah. I mean, one of the things that what we've got in all cases is loads of different versions. Some of them are pretty messy. Some of them have obviously got like mistakes or gaffes. Even coming up to like the proofs, there were things that we spotted where we were like, oh yeah, actually we've got that wrong over 7 different versions and multiple years, and finally got there in the end. But I suppose the other thing you could always say about a translation is, like a translation is never fixed. As Borges once said, only religion and tiredness give you a definitive version. And so, in the same way that we went back to the Antropólogos as it was, Cannibals on the Islands, and to do a second version, translations translations go out of date in a way that original texts don't.
Yeah, I'm just thinking because of my past experience of translating Old English, where there's a lot of prose versions of stuff around. And as Ben was saying, the form in Old English is essential to get the sense of where you are in the poem, because you can just read the prose translations and it's kind of like repetition, it's very boring, it's very slow. But then you say you have a verse translation, even if it is as literal as possible. If you get the alliteration and the caesura in the Old English verse, you then get a feel for the original, which you wouldn't get from a very, very, very literal prose translation. So I'd say yes, form is in poetry is essential to the translation, and almost there is no way of. It's like with quantum mechanics. There's no way of actually getting to the core of where it, the single thing, because there isn't one. If it's just literal, it's dead. You don't have the whole thing.
Yes, I personally learned a lot from Ben's translation to Spanish, because sometimes, you find ways of saying things. You are not almost native Spanish speaker, but you find ways that I think that's a very good way. I never had thought about that. So, and I think there's a collaboration there when you learn from from other person, but also the project in itself is a collaboration. I really, very like the covers. When I saw this cover, I really like, because it's Antropólogos en las islas. So when you have the, all the kilometer for the distance. But I really like this because on the one hand, you have the colors of the suffragist movement. On the other hand, you have the colors of the movement that we want to reflect with the new collection, which is the women's movement in Latin America, the green with the color used for the right to have a safe and free abortion in Latin America. So you have, these movements they also talk to each other. So I really I have nothing to do with the cover, so I don't know who designed it, but it made me think about, and it's quite punk as well, this. And I thought, an English flag in Argentina, maybe it's not the best. But because it has these colors, I think it's quite disruptive. And I quite like this the disruption that you want to do when you want to recreate the voices or the new voices. And I think the collaboration it happens at different levels.
I think that the one thing to add to that in both of the collections, so Sergio's poetry has a lot of connections with his work as a cultural activist, as a museum curator, and in Poesía Civil, but also in Lexicon, of a huge amount of research in terms of talking to people, research in terms of reading. I've had the great good fortune to visit Sergio in Bahía Blanca, and every poem is a box, or sometimes boxes, of papers and information and interviews. And so behind each of these poems, there are multiple voices, multiple sources. And the same as well with the British poetry as well. So someone like Emily Berry works with found text, works with other people's voices. So yeah. But I mean, in terms of actually the exercise, like translating can just be kind of quite lonely. You just sort of sit on your own and go down rabbit holes and spend ages looking at Google image searches to try and work out what actually something is. So being able to do it with someone else and then realize that you're not completely barking up the wrong tree, or when you are completely barking up the wrong tree, that there's someone to come and bring you down that tree it's a way of working that I've always really enjoyed.
I think on that note, we're at time. So thank you so much to the panelists, and also Sergio, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
And to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.